Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to have Phil back. And he's going to be talking about, we're going to be discussing Freud's civilization and its discontents. So the format is we'll go chapter by chapter. Phil will make some comments about a chapter or two, and then invite comments from everybody, and then we'll go to the next chapter. All right, Phil, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think Sigmund Freud probably needs no introduction. We've all been very well versed in a lot of his discoveries and I guess cliches, you might even say, that have become a commonplace. It's interesting, when I was preparing for this, I went and tried to see how many of his theories are a common currency among practitioners. So I went to like the American Psychiatry Association, and they're not really, from what I can tell, they're not really using a lot of his methods. They're not really using a lot of his frameworks. And to me, it's all the more interesting because there's this really clear divide between how much Freud has penetrated the public perception of the world, the public consciousness with his ideas, versus how much it is used or not used by professionals. So to me, it's very significant whenever this happens, when you have an idea that takes such a deep hold of our culture and our kind of view of the world, the way we operate with each other. I mean, we have all of these, like I said, cliches. We're just going through Oedipus Rex in the other meetup, and of course you have the Oedipal complex, Freudian slip. I mean, there's just so much of our culture is completely imbued with these Freudian frameworks. So I thought it might be good to go to a particular book that perhaps summarizes a lot of his ideas, but also brings it into focus by way of looking at the world, our culture, through this lens of psychology and psychoanalysis. So it's actually, I think, is a really interesting way to look at the world, not through the economic lens, not through the political lens, not through the sociological lens even, but through the lens of individual psychology. And it really, and I also like how Freud thinks. I mean, you can agree or disagree with his ideas, but he has a very lucid way of expressing himself, and it really invites a conversation, invites a discussion. So I thought this would be perfect for this group to think about these things, to talk them through, figure out what, where's the baby and where's the water, so we can separate, sorry to mix metaphors, wheat and the chaff, in his insights. But I really like thinking about some of his ideas. Now, just to be clear, these are, this is what Freud, I'm going to try to present what Freud thinks. This is not necessarily my ideas. So with that in mind, just to be clear that I'm not presenting my view on it, but trying to basically summarize the view that he expresses in this book. So the book is Civilization and Its Discontents, was written in around 1930. He started writing it in 1929. I think most of it was written by 1930, as the world was heading for the Second World War, interestingly enough. And so in some ways, this was a warning call. And of course, a lot of people after World War I believed that was the war to end all wars. And, here we have the League of Nations, and things are just going to go uphill with new technologies and, in kind of some of the ideals of Enlightenment and so on. Modernism, and perhaps we'll just leave all that old world behind, all of our old prejudices and so on. And Freud, in some ways, sounds his bell of perhaps of disbelief and a more balanced view on reality. So I also want to mention that the book originally was titled in German Das Unglück in der Kultur, which is unhappiness in civilization. It's interesting that in German, the word for civilization, the word for, I guess, the word that we use for culture, Kultur, is the same word, but it makes a lot of sense, especially as we read his thesis. It makes a lot more sense. So originally it was called the Unglück, the unhappiness, and then was changed to Unbehagen, which I guess means discontent. In French, it's translated as malaise. So kind of like the sickness of civilization, right? Anyway, with that in mind, let's just jump in and see what he has to say. So in chapter 1, Freud introduces this very curious phenomenon, and he calls it the oceanic feeling. This is a feeling of that transcends rationality, perhaps. It's a feeling of something greater than ourselves, and it's a feeling of oneness, or desiring to be one with the world. And I'm curious. I don't know if everyone here has experienced this. I think at some points when you see something particularly beautiful, maybe it's a sunset, maybe it's you're standing on the shore of an ocean. I remember some of the beautiful places in California that I visited that I think invite this feeling. But just a lot of places in the world are like that. Something wells up within, and we can't explain it, but there is something that is really uncalled for physiologically, perhaps, but we do feel it, and it's this feeling of oneness that Freud describes as perhaps one of the motivating factors for the rise of religion, right? It's some kind of a feeling like this that perhaps motivated early humans to, in his mind, of course, Freud as an atheist, to invent religion as an explanation, perhaps, of this feeling that is so common to humanity. So, but interestingly, and this is Freud's perspective. I thought as I was reading this, perhaps a religious person might say, well, the whole reason why you have this feeling is because it's in fact an echo of something. If I'm being poetic, perhaps it's an echo of those original words spoken at creation when God created the world, and it's echoing in your soul as you look at the wonders of creation. If we're being a little poetic here. But in the Bible, there is a verse that I thought kind of summarizes it, which says, this is in Ecclesiastes, he put eternity in their hearts. This idea that this oceanic feeling is perhaps something that is divine. So obviously that's the religious person's perspective. Freud, coming from a very anti-religious atheist perspective, he says, all right, so we have this feeling. Let's try to dissect it and figure out what we're talking about here. So the way he approaches it, he says, well, one of the things that is most obvious about our life, our existence, is that we are not the same as the external world. He calls this the reality principle. And the reality principle is something that we get at a very early age. As children, if we think back, the reality principle is actually becomes something very nebulous, because a child initially is in his mother's womb, and so he's definitely not separate from the world. He is in fact sort of one with the world while he's in the womb. And then the moment he's born, he tends to stay with his mother, and so that line of demarcation is still very tenuous. And it really takes a long time for a child to start to understand there are things that are his own body, and there are things that are not his own body. And what is the difference between those things? And so Freud brings all of this to say that perhaps the oceanic feeling is an echo not of the divine voice of creation, but perhaps it is just an echo of our experience from a very early age, where we do feel this oneness with the world. We don't know that there is no demarcation, and we feel one, and we feel good, and this feeling is a positive feeling. because as children, most of the time, there's that feeling of protection and warmth and love, and some of these things that tend to dissipate as we become older. And so perhaps this positive oceanic feeling is in fact an echo of this primal experience that we have at birth and following in the weeks that follow. But but there's another interesting twist to this. There's another instance that Freud brings up as a very unique time or unique experience that causes us to have this experience of oneness with the world, where we don't make a line, or we don't want to make a demarcation between us and the external world, and that's a feeling of being in love. Now, I don't really look at Freud as the most romantic person. To me, he's very kind of dry and objective, and in some ways, but it's interesting that he is so insightful to note this. It's hard for me to even think that he could have noted this without experiencing it himself. So this experience of being in love is when you feel that you're one with the other person. The lover wants to be one with the beloved, and the world literally melds the two of them together, and they don't feel separate. And of course, again, if we go to the religious side of things, a marriage is supposed to be this union where the two become one flesh, or the two become one. So there is that idea of unity and a disappearance of this very real line that we feel about almost everything, right? We know when we hurt, we know when the pain is somewhere outside. It's pretty easy for us to tell. But when you become involved with somebody emotionally, then their pain becomes your pain, their suffering becomes your suffering, their joy becomes your joy, and so on. There's this one kind of a unity of experience that is very interesting. And Freud pinpoints it. And of course, he says, well, the key here is love, eros. And this becomes one of the themes in the book that he obviously comes back to, because in Freudian framework, eros is a force that pretty much drives everything. Love makes the world go round. I mean, this definitely is true in Freudian terms. Of course, what he means by love is primarily sexual love, and then all the other loves are essentially an outburst or outflow from that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that is kind of his framework for thinking about the world and a certain progression from childhood to adulthood, and this experience of oneness and trying to regain this oceanic feeling. So he kind of draws a tentative equality sign between the oceanic feeling and the feeling of eros, and this idea of love. And then he makes another interesting statement. He says, well, when you think about it, the program of love in general is to kind of bring everybody together. And so if you kind of follow it to the conclusion, really what the objective is that we erase these borders completely. That's what love wants to do, right? If the experience of being in love with a particular person is like that, think about it on a larger scale. Well, we can talk about love in a family. A family is another cohesive unit, right? You don't really divide yourself from your family. Then think about a locality, think about a country, right? There's the idea of patriotism, love of your compatriots, people that share a lot with you. And then there's this idea, perhaps globalism, right? The global humanity as a one single entity. And the program of eros, or of love, is to kind of bring everybody together, meld these differences, and we regain this oceanic feeling. So that's all very intriguing. And he does make some other points. I want to stop here. I think this is good. I don't want to get distracted on some detours. So maybe stop here and see what we can glean from this thus far.
So this covers chapter 1, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Bill sent a link to the Wikipedia article on this. And actually, they have a very, very short summaries. So I'm going to read the summary of the first chapter, just to jog people's memory about this. And folks, and we'll formulate a bunch of questions like, what is this oceanic feeling? What is its nature? Is it positive? Is it negative? What is your evaluation of it? So firstly, is it there or is it not there? Is it good or is it not good? How do you think of this? Because Freud, he's identifying some things and then he's evaluating some things. So both those are important, both the identifications and evaluation. So let me read the synopsis here. Freud begins this work by taking up a possible source of religious feeling that his previous book, The Future of an Illusion, overlooked. The oceanic feeling of wholeness, limitlessness, and eternity. Freud himself cannot experience this feeling of dissolution, but notes that there exist different pathological and healthy states, example love, where the boundary between the ego and the object is lost, blurred, or distorted. Freud categorizes the oceanic feeling as being a regression into an earlier state of consciousness, before the ego had differentiated itself from the world of objects. The need for this religious feeling, he writes, arises out of the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father, as there is no greater infantile need than father's protection. Freud imagines that the oceanic feeling became connected with religion later on in cultural practices. So would love to hear your thoughts on the existence of this oceanic feeling and your evaluation of it. Do you agree with Freud, disagree with Freud? What do you think of this? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to speak. Would love to hear your comments. Anybody, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. He's making several points. He's saying that there is an oceanic feeling. Second is that it is rooted in, it is infantile, that it is a characteristic of an infant. And then he's saying that that is the base of religious feeling. Let's go with Lev first, followed by Bob. Lev, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment to say that to me, the reality of the oceanic feeling, it's I resist any kind of an impulse to even frame it in terms of does it exist or does it not exist. It certainly does. It's a timeless phenomenon and such a big part of human experience. The only thing that people, including great writers, ever seem to disagree about is how to talk about the feeling, what language to employ to talk about this feeling. And it points to many, it's kind of like any kind of dissension arises about the language we use because it places this feeling in a particular domain, which people may dispute, but the reality is undeniable, however we may describe it.
Excellent point. Absolutely true. It certainly does exist. And the greatness of Freud is that he has this richness of observations. He notices some things that people have not noticed before. And then he has all kinds of explanations. So that's why, no matter how much I disagree with him on several things, he's extremely important thinker because he noticed things for the first time. He named things for the first time. So thank you. Next up is going to be Bob, followed by Allison. Bob.
Hi. I'm intrigued by this oceanic point of view. where we are supposedly, I don't know if you want to say united with the world, um, but I wonder if this is true. I can experience this in a more narrow fashion right away. If when I watch a good movie, a film that's good enough for me to be immersed in it, and so I am there. I am at one with the movie. I don't know how much I forget myself, but I really sort of forget myself, and I identify with the characters. And to repeat myself, I'm at one with the it's a oceanic. It's not the whole world, but it's the film.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. That's a good distinction, because that feeling is there, at given time about particular things, and that feeling of oneness exists not only at the universal level, but also in specific terms at specific times. Excellent point. Next up is Allison.
Yeah, I think it absolutely exists. I felt it many, many times. I mean, dancing is very much like that, and it can be classical dancing, but also like being in a nightclub. I think the whole reason that we, when you're 20, you go to nightclubs in the middle of the night. I mean, that, it's a natural desire to have altered states of reality. I mean, even with children, when you see them spinning, they're spinning because they want to get dizzy, and it's kind of the same thing. But that also in some ways feels like a religious experience. And then the other one, like I know what Freud was saying as a baby, but also as a mother in pregnancy. You literally, the weirdest thing, because you're completely at one with someone, because that person actually physically is part of your body. And like I always said, I felt like I was possessed by the devil, because like this thing's kicking you. And I mean, it's the most surreal, like you can look at pregnant women and think of it, but it's not until you actually go through that experience. It's like nothing else. And the thing is that even when your kid is born and grows up, it never quite leaves you, because they were literally physically you at one point. I think that's where that like maternal, like mama bear thing comes, that you must protect, but it all comes from that. And then the other one, he's completely right about love. It's, when it's, you feel that sense. And then I think that's why, when someone's betrayed, it's just so agonizing, yeah.
Wonderful. Allison, thank you so much for bringing in the point about motherhood, because it is similar. It's like, that it's a reciprocal relationship. It transforms the mother as much as it, transforms the child in its being born. Its mother becomes mother as a result of being the mother of the child. Beautiful. Thank you.
One thing I want to mention, when my child was first born, I was pushing him in the stroller. He was 2 weeks old, and we were going to this park, and we we're crossing the street, and a car started backing up and was about like to hit the stroller. And I literally didn't even think. I just immediately stepped in front of the car to block the way so it would hit me first. And my parents were with me, and I just looked at them and I said, "What was that?" I said, "I've never thrown myself in front of a car before." And my mom just said, she's like, "You're a mom now. Mother's love is like nothing else." And it is a weird thing, because up until I had him, I never would have given up my life for anybody, like, and not even a partner. And I think that's where sometimes there's this jealousy that sometimes fathers have to these kids, because the mother's love for the children, to be honest, is stronger than the love for their partner. And they don't like that. But it's primal. There's all it is, primal. You can't help it.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you. Next up is Bill. Bill, go ahead.
Thanks. After I read the Wikipedia summary, and I started thinking about that oceanic feeling topic, and I started thinking about like what happened in the United States in the late 1960s and the early 1970s with like started out as the hippie movement, but then some very serious, dedicated spiritual people including some hippies, started a thing called the human potential movement. And then they created, among other things, like the what's that place up in Big Sur? I forget the name of it, but it's like it turned into a retreat center. But basically, what they were trying to do is Esalen Institute. There you go. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. They were trying to get methodical, or more methodical, about bringing that oceanic feeling into more and more of one's life on a daily basis, and figuring out what the methodologies for that were. And it got the moniker like new agey, like touchy feely, woo woo, because it was to people who weren't committed to that path, it seemed outer space like or whatever. But it's kind of the other point I wanted to make about it. Well, there's 2 points I want to make about it. It raises this question, there's kind of like the random oceanic feeling that you get if you just like kind of go to the beach and watch a sunset and it just kind of spontaneously comes. And then there's the kind of oceanic feeling you get when you're methodical about a spiritual practice, whatever the spiritual practice is, where, like getting it down to the method and what's like the science of it, in terms of like literally, like, I mean, the Buddha, for example, said, you should be kicking the tires of your meditation practice. That's how I heard a Buddhist meditation teacher teach the Buddha's teaching on this subject, even though there was no tires back in the Buddha's days. The point is, it's like hypothesis testing, it's a form of science. It's a way of knowing inner space and et cetera, et cetera. And so the other point I wanted to make about it is like the movement, the student movement in the late 1960s started out kind of like as a political movement and an interpersonal thing and a political thing, but then by the early 70s, kind of a branch split off into this more internal journey of internal, like finding happiness within instead of trying to find happiness outside through political change or something. And then it turned into the me decade. The 70s was the me decade, and where has it gone since? A lot of things that happened then in California have spread to the country, whether it's yoga or meditation or whatever. And so the final point I want to make is that it brings me back around to, like, Freud wrote this book in 1929, and the summary on the Wikipedia page seemed to suggest that he was kind of pessimistic, like humankind is like doomed because of all these internal conflicts within each person. But if you look at the story I just told about the late 1960s and 1970s, it kind of gives a more optimistic picture about like methodologies for spreading that oceanic feeling into more of one's life have been spreading through whatever it is, yoga, Buddhist meditation, whatever. And that kind of paints a different picture than Freud painted. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. I think this is a crucial point about this oceanic feeling, because, I mean, at 52 Living Ideas, we've been studying Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, and the Bible, the New Testament. And all of them, this is central to that. At that time, this feeling, this sense of oneness with the universe itself, kind of oneness within your consciousness, between people, and with nature, is essential part of all these three traditions. Modern world is different, and Freud is very much of a modernist. Modern world is analytical. It holds that you can deal with things only by breaking things down, into small parts and then trying to put things together. So somebody who starts by trying to start with the oceanic feeling, it considers to be not really scientific, something very odd. But when you look at these times, the axial age times, like 500 BC to about 580, this is the foundation, actually, of much of the thinking. It's like, be like water, my friend, or, the ocean and you being the drop in Bhagavad Gita, or, that love one another like you love God. I mean, all of those are versions of this oceanic feeling. So it's very real. and it is very universal, and it is absolutely kind of be experienced in a more concrete way, but there is a universal component of that on which many of these religions are based. So it's really, really interesting that Freud kind of zeroes in on the existence of it, and he has his own evaluation of it. So just a wonderful book to be going through. So let's look at the next chapter. Let's see where it takes it, Phil.
Right. So moving on, I do want to say one thing though. The oceanic feeling, I think of it as breadcrumbs. You know, it's not really what we're after, and I don't think that's what Freud is after. But it's the seed for the journey, right? So it's something that Freud notices as this interesting trait of our experience, and then he is like a detective, and he's following the trail. Where does it lead? And so his first thought is, okay, well, it leads us to two things. One is this childhood experience. Second observation is that it leads us to this concept of love that tends to unify and bind and dissolve boundaries. Now, the first thought in itself is very fruitful because it gives us a glimpse into psychoanalytics. The whole premise of psychoanalytics is that we have regions of ourselves that are not necessarily active, but they are populated with something. And Freud uses this interesting analogy of a city. He uses ancient Rome as an analogy because Rome has, is one of the more ancient cities that is still with us today and is still in use. And I've been to Rome actually this past year, so I can definitely, again, my second time, I can attest to this interesting experience of having, let's say, the Colosseum, which was built, I guess, a few years before AD, and having a subway station right next to it, and cars, built maybe 20 years ago, circling around the Colosseum, which was built thousands of years ago. So Freud's point is human mind is like that, where you have things that are layers of earlier and later experiences that accumulate. Now, not all of them are immediately obvious. So like in ancient Rome, they've unearthed some of these things that have been hidden for centuries. And all of a sudden, somebody puts a shovel in and unearths this whole new thing that was hidden. So, of course, if you know anything about Freudian psychology, then you know that the unconscious is that hidden layer that Freud he's the digger of that hidden layer, and he starts to dig and he starts to unearth all of these things. So we're going with this is that the childhood experience of, maybe I should say, infant's experience of oneness is another layer that Freud thinks is still there in our minds, in our being, but it's been obscured by all of our later experiences. But it's still there, and it still has that effect on us. Now, this concept, he doesn't really press it very far with the oceanic feeling because it's not that important to him. But he will press it much further as we go along. So I just wanted to point this out, that already we're trying to connect our experience as an adult in this world with some of our earliest experiences as an infant or child, experiences that, in fact, we're not consciously aware of at all. I mean, most of us do not remember our experience as a baby, right? Our earliest memories perhaps go to 2 to 3 years, maybe even later. But in fact, the most formative parts of our lives were lived before that. That's when we started to differentiate ourselves from the world. That's when we developed what Freud calls the reality principle, right? And then also that's when we developed the next principle, which is the subject of this chapter, the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is predicated on two things. One is, as you can probably guess, the securing of pleasure, anything that pleases us and is pleasant. And the second part is abstinence from pain. Pain is the killer of pleasure, so we need to do both to put the pleasure program into operation, as Freud says. So this program is, in fact, what Freud calls the purpose of life. So unlike some of the more high-sounding, profound ideas about the purpose of life, to Freud, he says, well, let's just look at how people live, and we can deduce the purpose from their actions. And after taking that survey, he says, you know what? From what I see, people are just trying to do two things: maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So that's the purpose of life from a sort of pragmatic perspective. And everything else is just, high, philosophy that's empty and barren. So Freud is very kind of materialistic, very cynical in that sense, but also perhaps insightful in that he just says, look, this is what human beings do. We try to avoid pleasure, try to avoid pain, and try to secure pleasure. And this, of course, happens from our earliest experience. And the way children do that, as somebody already mentioned this, is by looking at parents as a source of protection from pain. So parents, and specifically a father who is obviously a physically more robust or a formidable opponent, is perhaps the source of that protection. And this is the segue into religion, as Freud looks at religion as simply a extrapolation of this father figure into a more spiritual dimension. Now, this is very interesting, right? Because here we have the opposite of what Jung is saying with his archetypes, in a way. Jung would say that the reason we have such a strong connection to the father figure is because it's actually part of our collective unconscious, and part of this idea that fatherhood invokes this security. It's not something that we've conjured kind of rationally and said, well, or not rationally, but maybe experientially, and said, okay, well, this is because the father is the stronger one and he is the one that's protecting me. We're going to somehow conjure it up and somehow extrapolate it into a religious dogma. Jung would say, no, this is all very deep and at this completely unconscious level, and it's an archetype, in fact. And so the God figure is just an expression of that. But Freud says, no, it's actually kind of this very simple idea that, as a baby, we need a father, and as mankind, we have things that are larger than life that we need God, the father, the kind of the infinitely exalted father figure can deal with. And so religion to him is just the kind of extension of that same idea. Very similar to, I would say, to Marx in a lot of ways. Marx would say, famously said, religion is the opiate of the masses. And Freud would say, yes, religion is in fact completely false, and it's just used by the masses as a palliative of sort. It's a painkiller. It's a mind-numbing philosophy that obscures the painful reality, but it's needed because that's how we've learned to cope with realities, by having this sort of crutch of a view that allows us to deal with all the pain, all the suffering that we cannot otherwise deal with. So this is probably like the main point of chapter 2, together with some strategies. So what are the strategies of the pleasure principle? Well, like we said, the two obvious general ones are just abstaining and securing. But how do you do it, right? So there are two ways that you can deal with pain. So let's start with pain first. One is by what he calls powerful deflections. So you avert, you displace the pain by something else, maybe perhaps by greater pain, or perhaps by greater suffering. Religion is good at this, right? If you scare people with, let's say, eternal hell, perhaps they're not going to be as moved by, earthly discomforts. If you compare it to the prospect of eternal damnation, perhaps, having a sore throat is not so bad, or even being, I don't know, think of the worst thing that can happen, being raped or something. And I don't know, like, nothing beats eternal damnation, right? So that's deflection. The second part is, okay, well, what do you do when we're trying to maximize pleasure, but we can't all obtain all the pleasure? It's a resource constraint, right? There's so finite number of resources. There's more people than resources, more people than sources of pleasure that are unmitigated. So how do you deal with that? Well, you create substitutions. Again, religion is good at that. There are all sorts of ways, techniques. Prayer is one of them. We talked about, I think what somebody mentioned, meditation and yoga are ways that in the Eastern tradition, you again regain that sort of feeling of oneness, even perhaps in the face of things that are happening in the physical world that sort of portray the opposite. And then the interest, so these are both in some ways psychological strategies, but then the third one is a physiological strategy, and that's he calls it intoxication, which again, very common today, right? In all sorts of ways, we do it. Probably all of us do it in one way or another, right? So somebody has coffee, somebody drinks, somebody smokes, somebody vapes. We have drugs have become a part of our lives, and they have been pretty much for all of humanity's existence in one shape or another. So this is another way we cope with reality, and another way we have this kind of overall strategy for dealing with life's pains and pleasures. And so this is the kind of the three broad outlines that Freud makes. Speaking of substitutive satisfaction, he talks a little bit about two things that are available to people of a particular temperament or particular makeup. So that he doesn't make it universal. He says there's some people that are able to channel themselves into art and science and find pleasure in the pursuits of those. And in fact, I think he quotes Goethe, who says, he who possesses science and art also has religion, but he who has neither, let him have religion. That's the quote. And so art and science are seen as two sources of potential pleasure satisfaction that in Freud's mind are simply substitutive. They're not real thing. They're not really what we're after, but they're good enough for people of a particular temperament, a particular makeup, that it can help them again cope with reality. So Freud has this unique, kind of very cynical view on this whole thing. He doesn't think people do science or art for the sake of art or science. They do it because that's a coping mechanism to cope with the pain, and essentially they're still fulfilling the pleasure principle program. Now, some people definitely truly derive pleasure from mathematics. I mean, I do. I like reading about studying, and if you're a nerd, you know what I'm talking about, right? You'll love how nature works and reading about it and discovering things, and that gives a certain sense of pleasure. Freud says that is true, and he probably knows that by experience himself. I mean, he's a scientist. But at the same time, he says it's not the same pleasure that equals, that can really compete with physical experience. So he says, sexual experience is better than art or science, and you cannot, it's not going to compete with that, and it'll never win. And he will say something along the lines of, pain as well, right? You can only deflect, and you can only substitute, and you can only displace so much of pain with these other pursuits. And I think he's in a dialogue here with very famous treatise by Boethius. Boethius, The Consolations of Philosophy. Boethius was a thinker around the fall of the Roman Empire, and he is imprisoned, unjustly accused of subversion and disloyalty, and he finally dies in his I think he either dies in his cell, he's executed actually for it. He never leaves, but he writes this treatise on how to deal with kind of the injustices of life. And I think Freud, without mentioning him, he is definitely in a dialogue with him, and he says, well, that's all great, Boethius, but the physical suffering that you underwent in that cell, I'm not sure I buy the premise that philosophy and these intellectual pursuits were able to fully displace the actual pain you were going through. So he's a little bit more cynical about that, and he says as much. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, right. So this is, yeah, so when I first read this book, this was been some years ago, this is the thing that stayed with me. So I think Bill mentioned about being hopeful about us regaining the oceanic feeling and so on. This is, let me throw, let me rain a little bit on your parade there, Bill. So I'm gonna have to say that this is the thing that made me sit up and think about this, because it's one thing to be optimistic about things we can improve in our society, or even on a personal level or some other way. But what Freud observes is part of our makeup. And this is tough, because this has to do with changing ourselves. And that's a little tougher than most things, right? It's hard enough to change the external environment. It's hard enough to change politics. It's hard enough to change a lot of things, kind of mechanical things on the outside. But changing ourselves, that's a tough one. And so here's what Freud observes. He says this: the problem with the pleasure principle is the following. We can only experience pleasure as a difference. Think about this. You can only experience pleasure as it has to be a difference between what you're currently experiencing and the next thing that's going to bring you pleasure. If you want pleasure from a sexual experience and you start sleeping with women, it will only take so long before you will start hating it, or it will become just another thing. In other words, the pleasure tends to decay very, very quickly as you fulfill it, right? It's only fulfilling just before you have it, maybe right when you have it, and that's it. Same with food, same with anything else. No matter what it is that we crave, the moment we fulfill that craving and start repeating it, this difference is gone. The differential, which originally brought us pleasure, is gone. And so what that means is we're doomed to be dissatisfied just because of our makeup. Our makeup is such that we can only experience pleasure as this differential. So that to me was the most, I guess, maybe depressing thought, but I thought it was the most insightful observation about our Constitution. You know, our Constitution is such that we can really, truly only have a sense of tremendous pleasure through this differential. But once it's gone, it subsides to this kind of a very mild feeling of pleasantness. And that's not enough, right? That's not how we work. We can't just do a mild sense of pleasure. We need this differential. That's how people get hooked on drugs, because they take one drug, they get a certain high, but then once you do it a couple of times, the high is gone. You have to take a bigger dose. And that's how you exponentially go down that path and destroy yourself. So Freud, making this observation, he says, this is not great. I mean, we're not even talking about society yet. We haven't even gotten there. This is just us and the world, right? And we have this very curious makeup that we're kind of doomed to being dissatisfied just by the way we're made. So I'll stop here. I'm curious what you guys think on this idea of the pleasure principle and happiness as the meaning of life. Very curious. So Shrikant, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Phil. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to read a quick summary of the second chapter from Wikipedia, and then would love to hear any comments. The second chapter delves into how religion is one coping strategy that arises out of a need for the individual to distance himself from all the suffering in the world. The ego of the child forms over the oceanic feeling when it grasps that there are negative aspects of reality from which it would prefer to distance itself. But at the same time, as the ego is hoping to avoid displeasure, it is also building itself so that it may be better able to act towards securing happiness. And these are the twin aims of the pleasure principle. When the ego realizes that it must also deal with reality. Freud claims that the purpose of life is simply the program of pleasure principle. Freud claims that the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. And the rest of the chapter is an exploration of various styles of adaptations that human beings use to secure happiness from the world, while also trying to limit their exposure to suffering or avoid it altogether. Freud points out three main sources of displeasure that we attempt to master: our own painful and mortal existence, the cruel and destructive aspects of the natural world, and the suffering endemic to the reality that we must live with other human beings in a society. Freud regards this last source of displeasure as perhaps more painful to us than any other. And the remainder of the book will extrapolate on the conflict between individuals' instinct for seeking gratification and the reality of societal life. All right. Would love to hear any comments from anybody. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to offer any comments. We're going to start with Lev, followed by Bob. Lev.
Yeah, just to, there's a single word that I would love to highlight from this portion of the text, which is not even the obvious ones, which is pleasure and pain, but the word program. I love the use of the word program here in that it so clearly accentuates the automaticity, this important aspect of human life, the automaticity of it, the mechanism, that it's this idea of man as mechanism, that it's not meant to be a kind of a totalizing image of man, but certainly such an important aspect of human life that, and the word program really gets to that, which is, one of the reasons I really appreciated this chapter as we get into the narrative.
Thank you, Lev. Next up is Bob. Bob, go ahead.
I may be missing something, but I'm thinking of the difference between the pleasure principle and this oceanic feeling. What I heard you saying, Philip, about the pleasure, what Freud said about the pleasure principle, there's a difference between sensual experiences, like when my first slice of a piece of pie might be delicious, but the tenth will run down, and sensual is kind of an immediate experience. There are all kinds of pleasures and pains that are that go beyond sensual, like for example, emotions. Emotions can be painful, frustration and ease and so on. Where and whereas oceanic, you're way out there. It's not something like religion is not an immediate thing. It's a social. You learn it social through your social experiences, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, I would only add, Bob, that religion can be quite physical as well. And in fact, I think, wasn't there a famous author William James, right? Isn't he the one that wrote the variety of religious experiences, like a treatise, a classic treatise on experience of, and this is just in America, right? Different Christian denominations in America towards, I guess, in the late 1800s. But this is, it could be quite physical. I mean, you go to, a Pentecostalist denomination, and it's very joyful and uplifting, and everybody's singing and kind of swaying together. And you might feel this oceanic feeling in church. I mean, and that's why people will go to a cathedral, right? Or go to a place of worship, because they will feel something there that they don't feel in a shopping mall, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. For example, singing, choral singing in church is essential. Also, religion. Some religions have a great deal well, maybe all religions have a great deal involvement with rituals, and those are immediate practices that you hesitate to say that a ritual is pleasant or painful, but it's a process that has a certain amount of satisfaction to engaging in it, and you could call that pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bob. Next up is Bill.
Thanks. So according to the Wikipedia summary of this chapter, it says there's 3 sources of emotional discomfort: the external non-human world, like nature, the external human world, like interactions with other people, and then the internal world of one's own body, like health issues or something that can cause emotional discomfort, what have you. So I wanted to kind of give an angle on what Philip said about like the optimism versus pessimism kind of debate, or so-called. So in the Wikipedia summary, it uses this word adaptation to summarize at least something that Freud talked about in this chapter, like human adaptations to minimize emotional discomfort or physical discomfort, whatever, any kind of discomfort, displeasure, what have you. And maybe not maximize pleasure, but at least get enough of it to be happy. So I want to frame that in a contractual perspective, because in particular with respect to sources of discomfort that come from interactions with others and sources of discomfort that come from within one's own self. Solutions to those discomforts come in the form of contracts of one kind or another. And you can tell a long story of human history as the evolution of contracts between people, economic contracts, social contracts like social norms, political contracts like constitutions, to establish lane markers about what's prohibited and what's permitted. And the things that are prohibited because they cause discomfort or displeasure or pain. Okay. And there's really 3 categories. There's that the contracts deal with. There's what's prohibited, and what's one category. Category 2 is what's permitted, and category 3 is what's obligated. Things you're obligated to do, either to refrain from doing or to do to have mutual gains from exchange with others. And so that's interpersonally. And even within oneself, self-discipline can be framed as a contract with oneself that establishes lane markers for what's prohibited, like not eating so much sweets that one gets diabetes or becomes overweight or what have you, or gets heart disease, whatever, any number of things. Like, and what's obligated, like go to the gym to keep one's muscles strong, etc. And then what's permitted, kind of discretionarily, is the 3rd category. So the point of all this is to say you can frame the pessimism view as saying the contracts never keep up with essentially unchangeable human reality. You can frame the optimism view as saying, actually, the contracts have more than kept up. They've gotten better and better and better at reducing sources of discomfort and increasing at least enough sources of comfort to make more and more people on the planet happy. Like, for example, millions, hundreds of millions of people in China lifted out of extreme poverty through economic contracting in ways that they're less unhappy. Or you could frame it kind of in the middle, like an oscillation model, where it's sometimes the contracts don't keep up and you get, eruptions of lots of discomfort with lots of people. And then other times when the contracts catch up and it kind of solves that and things kind of are looking up. So the point of all is simply to say that, a contractual framework helps understand the evolution of human adaptations to deal with the pleasure pain dichotomy. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. I have one comment.
On that real quick.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
not to get into a polemic here, but Bill, my model was essentially, let's imagine that you are the only person in the world, and it's a beautiful world filled with whatever you want, let's say you're like on some tropical island. So there's no contract you need with anyone else. You're there by yourself, like the Robinson Crusoe type situation. So Freud would say, even in that perfect world where you don't need to compete with anyone, nobody's going to come and rob you or steal something from you, you are still kind of screwed, and we're all kind of screwed because of our constitution. So it's a deeper thing, right? Who do you make a contract with to change your own nature? Now, you can definitely exercise self-discipline and so on, and that could be a contract. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but this is going to be more like a super ego, right? Part of you that is sitting on top of it and saying, okay, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and maybe not even fret and not be unhappy and so on. But Freud would say that's not actually you. That's this other thing, and we're going to talk about it in a second, or maybe, I don't know if we'll get to it today or not, but that's the super ego. The ego part is just your personality. That's the part that we're like dealing with all the time. And then underneath all of that, you have this ocean boiling with all of these primal instincts. The two of them primarily are, well, let's putting aside the destructive one, primarily is the eros. So this pleasure principle, which needs to be satisfied, has to do with what he calls libidinal desires, right? Desires for objects, whether it's sexual objects or material objects or any kind of objects. That's our biggest drive. So when you think about it like that, when you think about just you right now, not anyone else in the world, what do you say? I mean, this is pretty damning to me. Like Freud puts his finger on it and says, the way we are set up, our biological or psychological nature, is that the marginal return on any satisfaction we can get from the physical world is diminishing exponentially. And that's that. Thank you.
Let me go ahead and respond to that one, because that's the point that I wanted to talk about. I really like Freud because he is a pioneer in making observations for the first time. But because of that, he notices only some things about human beings. So for example, the link that I put in the chat on the archaeology of the mind is the work of Jack Panksepp, who has studied different kinds of emotions. So I want to give you, he identifies 7 kinds of emotional circuits, each having their own signature. What Freud is describing is what Panksepp calls the seeking circuit. The way in which seeking circuit works is that you're going like this, you notice something you like, and your state goes down because you don't have it. When you get it, you come back to the same level. So it's like, it's unending, just misery, because you notice that, you get hurt that, okay, I don't have it. And then you get it, you come to the same level. You don't go any higher than that. That is the seeking circuit. That's so entire of this discussion of Freud is based on the seeking circuit. But there are these other 6 circuits, which are very different nature. The 2 circuits, which are more common to higher animals, higher mammals, actually. This work of Panksepp is not even about, it's on mammals. So for example, one of the things that provides a very definitive contrary argument to Freud is the care circuit that that Allison was talking about. It's not, mothers don't say that, okay, I've had enough of you and that I don't need you anymore. I'm completely satisfied. I have had enough of my child. The child doesn't say that to the mother. The care circuit, its signature is dramatically different than that of seeking circuit. And that's what keeps us alive as mammals. That's the only reason we are alive as mammals. So we are not just seeking beings as Freud holds. I respect him for identifying this seeking nature and the characteristic. In his own way, he actually gets the seeking circuit and the lust circuit, which is the second circuit. Those two he gets. He doesn't get care. He doesn't get play circuit. All children play. The play has a very different characteristic. There are other three characteristics, other three circuits: fear, panic or feeling that you will lose something, or rage. They have very different characteristics of their own. So mammals, we forget about human beings. Mammals have all these circuits, and each of them have a certain function, biological function. And Freud gets the seeking circuit and lust circuit, which is very similar to the seeking circuit, but he misses all these other ones. So somebody like Panksepp, who has actually studied the brain and emotions with the modern tools, so he studies it through multiple means. He studies what happens to chemicals, what happens to it at the electrical level, what happens to it at a behavioral level, what happens to it in terms of response to things. So he uses like 4 or 5 different modes of studying the patterns of each of these circuits across multiple mammals, and generalizes nature of emotions based on that. That is a far more robust understanding of emotions than Freud's. So Freud is missing, because he's discovered the seeking circuit. He has gone to town on it, and he is never satisfied with it. He plays with it. He's not satisfied. He keeps going. So it shows he's using play circuit. But anyway, that's just a minor thing. But what I'm saying is that it is very
Freud is discontented. Like he predicts, he is discontented.
Exactly. He says, okay, seeking circuits, I will just keep seeking, and I won't find it. The other thing I want to say is that we have to check, whenever we are studying these people, we have to check the premises. So what he's saying is that there are 3 main sources of displeasure. And so he says that we by nature are very upset about ourselves, our own natures, the fact that there are other people around us, and nature. Okay, now you have to say, okay, do you agree with that? Is that a fair evaluation of nature? Is it a fair evaluation of other people? Is it a fair evaluation of yourself? And if your premises are different, then your conclusions are also going to be very different than Freud's. Right. Next up is Allison.
Yeah, I have a couple of points to make. Well, one, I think this, this constantly seeking new pleasure is the whole reason that dating apps exist, and it becomes like a thing where, that's, I won't say which one, but they're all like that. And it's this constantly wanting new, and they're making massive amounts of money because people want new. It's also responsible for a lot of demise of many marriages, because they want, some people are perfectly happy. They get married, they're done, they're happy, they live in bliss. But some people, they always want that rush of the new. And, sometimes it's men, sometimes women are doing that too, or they're sabotaging their engagements or trying to, because they want this rush of this attraction by somebody new. And it doesn't matter who, they get that. It's why they always say cheaters always cheat, because they get that person and then they go on to the next one, then they cheat on the next one and the next one and the next one. So, but you know, that's not everyone. And then you also have some people who never marry because for the same reason, they want the rush of that, and they never want because it's like a quieter pleasure to have a relationship that just lasts for many, many years. And again, it's not everyone. So, I mean, he hit on something really, really important, but not everybody lives their life that way. You know, it's more like he's saying, well, this is what people do, but he's not, probably most people actually don't live their life like that. It's a smaller percentage. But one of the things that I wanted to take issue with was Bill was saying something about that, you know, people who eat too many sweets, they become overweight, and that's why they're overweight, because they're eating too many sweets. And I want to take issue with that, because there have been many, many, many times on these Zooms that I have listened to comments like that, and I've always held my tongue. And it's usually men making those comments. And one, weight is genetic. There's all kinds of science that shows we look like our parents. So I feel like the diet industry is making a massive amount of money by bashing people, primarily women, for their weight. They don't do it. Football players are very obese, but they're muscular, but they're massive men, and they are celebrated for their size, and women are not. And what is held up as this role model is a 20-year-old woman's body. That's what's held up, because when women go through pregnancy, they put on weight because there's a human being inside them. When women go through menopause, their estrogen level plummets and they put on weight, and it's almost impossible to get rid of. And what is the issue that I have with this is women do not come on Zoom and bash men for aging. Men go gray or they lose their hair with age, and none of the women sit there and say, oh, it's your fault. What's wrong with you? You don't take care of yourself. Because no, we just say, oh, they got older. Okay. And we accept that men age. But when men say this under the guise of fitness, they're not fitness that they're after. They want women to look like 20-year-olds. And to be honest, if a grown man wants a grown woman to look like a 20-year-old, there's something wrong with that. All right, that's my speech.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. All right, let's go to chapter 3.
Let's do it. This is a very lively discussion, as probably Freud always, with digging deep down into our psyche. This is good. I like this. All right, so chapter 3, we continue on this journey of trying to discover the purpose and the development of civilization, right? So we started out by following the breadcrumbs of this oceanic feeling. We got into this idea of something happens in our childhood and it leaves an imprint on us. And what happens in our childhood is stays with us throughout our adult life, which is this pleasure principle, right? The pleasure principle, which is about trying to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, and the different strategies that we can employ to achieve that. Love is being touted as one of the more popular ones, although, as Freud notes, romantic love is one of those experiences that leaves us the most vulnerable. So it's a risky bet, right? You gain a lot, but you can lose a lot. And so he mentions a lot of the sages throughout the ages have said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't bet everything on romantic / sexual experiences. You have to look for satisfaction and happiness and pleasure from other places. And so he mentions some of these other things we talked about. Now, in third chapter, the emphasis turns from the pleasure part to the pain part, my favorite part. I guess I'm a little masochistic, as Freud would say. The pain part is threefold in nature. It comes from our own bodies, which again, to me, this is it's so interesting that a lot of this stuff has nothing to do with society, has nothing to do with civilization. It's really part of our makeup. We are made in a way that already invites disaster. The moment we're born, we're getting old, right? Allison mentioned getting old, so we're getting old. True that. So that's inevitable. Our bodies are disintegrating. So the pain part is already set in, even from the youngest age. We break things. We have doctors to follow us throughout the length of our lives, unfortunately. So that's number one. Our own body is the source of pain. Second is the physical world around us. Now, we've actually done, we've made a lot of progress there. And so on the progressive side, I'm here with Bill. I would say, yes, we definitely have made a lot of progress on the physical external world side. This is both medicine-wise, this is protection, right? And still, even with all of this, there's still hurricanes, earthquakes. I mean, I'm lucky. I've never experienced any of these things, but I know that people have experienced them and they're horrific, and people are buried under rubble. And I mean, it seems so unreal for the people that do experience it. It's hard for us to actually take it in. We live in, I guess, in a not a very active seismic area. So it's hard but maybe some of you live in probably more active seismic area. Maybe you probably didn't want to be in Hawaii in the last couple of months. So all of these things, external things, that's another source of pain. But really, the last one is the most important, and that's coming from other people. Who was it that said hell is other people? I forget, but somebody really smart. Was it Sartre or somebody like that? So anyway, Freud says the pain that is caused by other people is the most profound, not the external, not the bodily. It's the other people. And so that is, that we have this sort of three-pronged pitchfork aimed at our visceral area that we're trying to avoid throughout our lives. This three-pronged thing. And so in Freud's mind, civilization is the way we answer the challenges of being alive and of dealing with these three areas of pain. So civilization allows us, number one, to pool our resources together so we can accumulate and learn and build up technology and build up all of the different ways that we can address the external world and our own body, right? The progress we've made in those two areas are definitely due to technology and due to our ability to pool resources. A single person living on the outside like Tarzan would not have been able to develop medicine and would not have been able to build dams and so on and do all sorts of things that we do today to both predict weather, to try to forestall some of these things. I mean, it's amazing. The amount of control that we've gained over nature is something spectacular. And Freud acknowledges that, and he says that we've become prosthetic gods, as he says. We have become the objects of these myths and legends of ancient Greece and Rome, right? We are Zeus, we are Poseidon's, we are all of these things that we can fly now, we can do all sorts of things, but we're prosthetic, right? We can't do it on our own. Unlike the gods of ancient Greece, we need some additions, extensions, right? Technological extensions that allow us to do that. So prosthetic gods, but gods nonetheless. And so, but then there's the other thing, and this is the key observation that goes into the title of this book. On the one side, civilization has allowed us to make huge strides in those first two areas, but where it has definitely not helped us is in the area of well, I shouldn't say that in the interpersonal arena. Yes, it has helped too, but at the same time, it has created a world that is plagued by lack of freedom. I mean, this idea that we've lost all of the freedom that we've had, supposedly, presumably, right? I'll say this because, again, this is a presumption that we enjoyed a much greater level of freedom in a less civilized context. This was of course, the original premise of Rousseau in his treatise on inequality. He says, man was born to be free, but is everywhere in chains. And of course, anthropologists have since challenged that view that man has had this idyllic past. But nonetheless, it's probably true that, you know, a person 100 years ago was probably more free than a person today from a lot of different aspects. And so some of that technology, some of that civilizational, some of those benefits from civilization have come at a very high cost. And so Freud mentions in this context, in connection with this, the idea of neuroses. Neuroses, of course, is a pent-up frustration that essentially lives in that unconscious level until it spills over into the conscious. And of course, Freud's famous work on interpretation of dreams and the idea of a Freudian slip. What is that? What is Freudian slip? It's the unconscious bubbling up. We can no longer keep it undercover, and it bubbles up and we express it, losing control of our, you know, of our id, the unconscious level, right? That's the Freudian slip, and it's a sign of a neuroses that are plaguing us. In general, the idea is that we have this energy, the primal energy that's driving everything, sexual energy, libidinal is called by Freud, libido, which basically just means desire, right? That's what it is. Libido is desire. We have a desire, and that's what drives our lives. But civilization is there to regulate and to limit those desires in this very elaborate calculus of how do we maximize everybody's pleasure, and how do we minimize everybody's pain, not just a particular individual. So Freud says, okay, great. So we've developed these, you know, very complex social structures to help us with that, but really at what cost? And the cost is borne by individual ego, by this the personality. I mean, ego is not a negative thing. It's what Freud calls the I, right? It's the person, the self. So the self bears this pressure from civilization. And of course, there's also another observation that Freud makes, and it's this. He says, you know, we pride ourselves on our technological achievements, but it's a double-edged sword. A lot of the things that are solved by technology are the problems that were created by technology. We created the problems of, you know, like he makes this example of, you know, I can now call my daughter that lives in a different country. But if it wasn't for technology that took that daughter from living next to me to that different country, I would need a phone to call her. I would just talk to her. So in other words, technology in some way solves the issues that are created by civilization. There weren't issues before civilization. Like you can say the same about even our healthcare, right? A lot of the issues that we're dealing with in healthcare are created precisely because of our way of life that is driven by our success and by our development. So it's a very interesting topic of how civilization both helps us and hurts us at the same time. And it's not clear to Freud that the benefits necessarily outweigh the costs. And I will stop here. There's still a lot more here on this in this third chapter. I don't know if Shrikant, maybe we can take some questions or some comments, and then I'll finish up this third chapter. There's still quite a bit left here in my notes.
Sure. Do you want me to read the summary now?
Yeah, maybe let's keep the summary until after I.
After
yeah, maybe just do some comments on first.
All right. So, folks, any comments on this section? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. I'll give a few more seconds.
Yeah, if nobody wants to talk, then
yeah, let's continue. Let's finish up the
Okay.
chapter and then go for questions.
All right, so then let's so Freud then steps back and says, well, okay, before we start delving deeper, what we really need to do is we need to define civilization or Kultur in German. What makes Kultur? What makes how do we judge if a culture is civilized or uncivilized? What makes it one or the other? What are some abiding characteristics of a civilized versus uncivilized experience? And he names a few that are most obvious that everybody would probably agree with. And the first one is, of course, protection from the randomness of external world. So protection from randomness, I would say in general, is a good example, a good description of civilization, right? So we protect our ability to protect ourselves through technology primarily. The second is cultivation of natural resources, right? That's another aspect of civilization. If we can, if a highly developed civilization is marked by high resource usage and all sorts of ways of cultivating it, including domestication, including all sorts of things along those lines. And then we get into some interesting other things that are not necessary to life per se, but are still highly prized in most people's minds. So when we think of civilization and being civilized, one of the things that comes up is this idea of beauty. Now, beauty is kind of not here or there, right? It's this thing that we don't really need it to live physically, and yet it occupies a huge part of our life mentally and spiritually. And most people would desire some type of experience that is aesthetic in order to think of themselves as civilized. So we have various ways of expressing it, but beauty, definitely, aesthetic experience is one of those characteristics that is somewhat surprising. And Freud, of course, is going to sink his talons into this one and make sure that we understand why that is. But beauty is one. The other one is cleanliness. I thought this was really interesting. As I was reading this, I thought, I wonder what would Freud say about New York City today, because we're definitely not very clean these days. So maybe our civilization is in decline, according to Freud. Definitely cleanliness is not something that is on the up and up in America as a whole, I would say. But definitely, you go to Denmark or Finland or any of those countries, very clean. Probably Freud is happy with them, very civilized. And again, cleanliness, just like beauty, not a primary factor of survival necessarily. Now, there's the aspect of hygiene, and Freud says, yes, there's some of that. But the way we are obsessed with cleanliness, this is something strange, he says. We need to investigate this. There's something here that doesn't make sense from a purely physical perspective. I mean, we shouldn't be this obsessed with it. And of course, again, I'm curious because now we definitely are not obsessed with it. Like I said, in America, nobody cares. There's garbage thrown all over the place, and nobody really cares. But it used to be that people would take offense at things just laying around, and in general, those two things, beauty and cleanliness, they really are an expression of something else, which he calls order. So things have a proper place, essentially, right? And beauty is another way of saying something is very orderly, has a certain symmetry that is pleasing to the eye. So that's beauty. So those are some interesting characteristics of a civilization. Then the other one is cultivation of humanities, arts, sciences, religion. Those are definitely additional characteristics that are not strictly needed as either pain or pleasure principle, right? So why are they there? And then the last one is, of course, probably most important one, which is the fact that in a civilized society, you replace a power of a single individual with a power of the group. So we, in a Hobbesian-like bargain, we trade the power of we give up our individual sovereignty to commit violence and revenge, and we give that authority to the state, and that's what constitutes a civilized society. So we limit. No individual is more powerful than the group, and that's the mark of the civilization that probably is like the foundation of everything else that follows. So the last part is the most intriguing part here. It's like a cliffhanger, and it says, you know what? I'm observing something very, very interesting here. These characteristics of civilization map pretty interestingly in my mind, this is what Freud says, to child development. So remember we started with the oceanic feeling and kind of the experience of a child. Now we're back into that. And Freud says, there's something interesting about children. And one of the things that you notice about children is they are, number one, they're not very obsessed about being cleanly. They're not particularly interested in this cleanliness business. Children do all sorts of atrocious things. They play with mud. They're just like not at all interested in order, in cleanliness. And the most important part, and I'm sorry I have to mention, and again, see, I'm even apologizing now. It's very interesting. I'm not like offending anyone, but I'm apologizing in advance because we have to mention this. Children are not really abhorred by their feces. They defecate and they poop their pants and they don't think much about it. But we do. I mean, as adults, can you imagine any of us showing up to work and making it up? I mean, this would be a scandal. We would be fired. We would be made I can't think of a greater shame or as an adult than doing something like this. Now, Freud says it's not reasonable, right? There's some hygiene aspect. We get that. But the way we're abhorred by this, there's something really interesting going on here. We need to explore this. So he's a guy that's not going to back off of this until he completely unnerves it. But he says that as children grow, they very quickly realize that if they keep pooping in their pants and not clean after themselves, they're going to become a pariah. So they learn this, and the child becomes more aware of all of some other things, like the following. If you notice, a baby doesn't really care about anyone else but himself or itself. He will cry, he will laugh, he will do whatever it needs to do. He doesn't care about anything, doesn't care about other people's judgments of it. He will yell in a train full of people and not think another thing about it. Now, we don't do that. We are in a cage that is held not by law so much, but by what other people are going to think of us. We have this very social, socially constructed matrix that keeps us at bay, most of us anyway, unless you're a psychopath. And we say that's a psychological disorder when someone is not, in fact, kept in this cage. But children are initially not at all in this cage. And they as they grow older, and we say they learn and they mature and so on, they actually, several things happen. They become aware, more self-aware. They become aware of the limitations, and they start limiting their desires based on the limitations imposed by others. That's exactly what civilization does. Civilization is a limiting mechanism for our desires. And the last thing, or the first thing, was this idea of cleanliness. They become more aware of this aspect. So I'll stop here because this is the kind of the cliffhanger, and then we go into more detail in the next chapter.
All right. Let me go ahead and read the summary, and then we'll go from there. Give me just a second. All right. Give me a second here. I just want to get people in the chat room. Okay, I'm going to let them in. All right. The third chapter of this book addresses a fundamental paradox of civilization. It is a tool we have created to protect ourselves from unhappiness. And yet, it is our largest source of unhappiness. People become neurotic because they cannot tolerate the frustration which society imposes in the service of its cultural ideals. Freud points out that advances in science and technology have been at best a mixed blessing for human happiness. He asks, what society is for if not to satisfy the pleasure principle, but concedes that as well as pursuing happiness, civilization must also compromise happiness in order to fulfill its primary goal of bringing individuals into peaceful relationship with one another, which it does by making them subject to a higher communal authority. Civilization is built out of wish fulfillment of human ideals of control, beauty, hygiene, order, and especially for the exercise of humanity's highest intellectual functions. Freud draws a key analogy between the development of civilization and the libidinal development of the individual, which allows Freud to speak of civilization in his own terms. There is anal eroticism that develops into a need for order and cleanliness, a sublimation of instincts into useful actions, alongside a more repressive renunciation of instinct. This final point Freud sees as the most important characteristic of civilization, that is, more repressive renunciation of instinct. And if it is not compensated for, then one can be certain that serious disorders will ensue. The structure of civilization serves to circumvent the natural processes and feelings of human development and eroticism. It is no wonder then that this repression could lead to discontent amongst civilians. All right, now it's your turn to speak. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to speak. Next up is going to be Will, followed by Bill. Will.
Thanks, Shrikant. Thank you, Philip. It's so interesting. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just thinking, it might not be that relevant, but I was thinking on the topic of cleanliness and what Carl Jung and cleanliness and the shadow, and just his sort of views that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And I just thought of that in the context of cleanliness and trying to people are obsessed with cleanliness, have been brainwashed into it. And also from with people with obsessive compulsive disorder, the more the external world is chaotic, the more they will clean in order to try and assert control over their immediate environment, because they can't control the external. So the more stress they're under, the more they will do their cleaning rituals. And I thought of that in regards with Jung, that perhaps this unconscious, unsavory aspect of our psyche, which is not acceptable to the conscious mind, that's thus why we try and shine the bright light, which part of the bright light could be cleanliness and trying to present a perfect impression all the time. So I just found that really interesting that Freud spoke about cleanliness, but he thought of it more as a positive thing. I think like I wouldn't think that he would have thought that it could have gone too far, as Jung would say, that somebody who was trying to be absolutely perfect all the time might actually be repressing something. But anyway, I just thought it was very interesting, the cleanliness aspect. Thanks.
Thank you, Will. Next up is Bill.
Thanks. So some social scientists did a study of the #1 predictor of happiness in adulthood, or of the predictors, the statistical predictors of happiness in adulthood. And I mention this because at the beginning of that paragraph that Shrikant read, it talked about the paradox of human civilization being about the pursuit of happiness, yet producing people who are unhappy. So it turns out that statistically, the #1 predictor of happiness in adulthood is whether a person in childhood was taught delayed gratification by their parents. And so this illuminates a number of phrases in that paragraph description of Freud's chapter, starting with frustration tolerance, tolerance of frustration. So basically, when a child is forced to delay their gratification, it's frustrating. But when their parent teaches them how to delay their gratification, they learn how to digest their frustration. And more generally, they learn how to digest disappointments of various kinds, like you can't have the cookies now, you have to wait till after dinner, my son, or whatever it is, you know. And the capacity to digest disappointment when learned in childhood continues into adulthood, and one has the capacity to digest disappointments in adulthood. But on the other side of the coin, if one was not taught delayed gratification in childhood, and one did not learn how to digest disappointments emotionally in childhood, then one has difficulty digesting disappointments in adulthood, which leads to the other things talked about at the end of that paragraph description by Freud, where he says that instincts wind up being repressed and sublimated, and that's where all the neuroses come from. And he uses those words: instincts, repression, sublimation. So the point here is that a child in their terrible twos thinks that, you know, a disappointment is a catastrophe. Good things are great to a 2-year-old, and disappointments are horrible. It's a catastrophe. And what is that about? It's about a fear of deprivation of their survival needs. You know, that's why a child who's 2 goes kind of bonkers at small things, because something in them is fearing deprivation of their survival needs. And when they don't learn in childhood how to digest disappointments and those kinds of fears of deprivation of survival needs, then in adulthood, they wind up sublimating and repressing and projecting the fear of deprivation of their survival needs into lots of situations that lead them to search for the perfect solution. And that's where, in that paragraph description, Freud is talking about the wish fulfillment aspect of cultural ideas and the search for kind of perfection. And so when people are kind of misdirecting their own inner emotional lives from their childhoods into the external pursuit of cultural ideas of a perfect form, you get lots of problems in society. You get all sorts of perfectionism, whether it be the perfectionism of cleanliness, or workaholism, or ideological perfectionism in the political realm, or, you know, wealth perfectionism, someone trying to be the wealthiest person in the world, what have you. So it all kind of traces back to the ability to digest disappointments. And the more people learn how to digest disappointments, either in childhood or in adulthood, the more they don't, you know, sublimate and project their inner needs onto other pursuits in society that causes these forms of unhappiness. So I'll stop there.
Excellent point, Bill. You know, when I was listening to Freud's take on civilization, I thought, I don't think he understands civilization, just like he doesn't understand emotions as a whole, of all the range of emotions. I don't think he understands. For example, this delayed gratification is a heart of absolutely the crucial thing about civilization. You know, without civilization, you know, you can function without instincts. And it seems like he's always thinking like a more primitive being as human being, and everything else as being kind of non-human. So just like, you know, seeking circuit is there, but care circuit develops a little bit later. You know, 2-year-old doesn't have a full care circuit. Similarly, civilization things are kind of more advanced things. I don't know whether he grasps the nature of civilization. So that's just, you know, what is civilization? What is it that makes it tick? I don't think he grasps the full thing, you know, full extent of it. And I think delayed gratification is a crucial part of it, because it is ability to say that, you know, things will happen over time and space, as opposed to right here, right now, which is what instinct is, you know, really good at doing. So thank you. Next up is going to be Eleanor, followed by Zheng. Eleanor. Oh, just a second. Let me make sure. Yeah, go ahead, Eleanor.
Yeah, I think Freud was good in positioning neurosis in case of, let's say, repression of the libido, when human beings develop through repression some sort of protection mechanisms, which are actually the neuroses. And delayed gratification is a great experiment. Just one has to consider if kids are hungry or not, especially if experimenting with food. There are testings about marshmallow. There is a book about the marshmallow tests from a professor from Princeton University. And I think it's also cultural, and it depends on in what country you're testing it, because some kids are hungry. It shouldn't be marshmallow test shouldn't be performed on hungry kids. It's kind of abusive. So yeah, I think it's terrible to ask a hungry child to wait on a marshmallow, but it's just my opinion.
Thank you, Eleanor. Next up is going to be Jen. Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I happened to read Freud's biography a long time ago, and I think opposite to what he's promoting, his life just the opposite. You know, he was from poor family, and he tried to do research, and his professor persuade him because that only rich people can actually afford to do research. He should do practice. So from my understand, his life is not what he. Maybe it's just overcompensating. Maybe because he didn't experience all those sex or I think he was a marshmallow test. He will win for sure because he delayed gratification in his own life experience for sure. That's maybe the reason his research focused so much on the opposite side. I think we always overcompensate, what we're missing. Just like somebody mentioned, if we keep the outside world so clean because we are in chaos inside. From what I know about Freud, I think maybe he's not what he's promoting for sure. He's just opposite what he's promoting in his theory, basically.
Thank you, Jen. All right. Anybody else wants to comment? You're welcome to do that. You know what? We're coming to the coming close to 10 o'clock. So let's do kind of concluding thoughts here. I really like reading Freud because, historically, he's a very important thinker. I have profound respect for people who make observations and who are courageous enough to say what they think, and they bring those issues to our, forefront. I profoundly disagree with him on most things, but I have tremendous gratitude to him because we are standing on his shoulders. Before that, people did not make observations. They were scared about making observations about human nature. And again, as Phil pointed out, the thing I like is that he very clearly says what he thinks. And you can look at it and say, okay, what of this is true? What of this is false? What is it that I can see evidence for? So that's why, I think it's great. And here, so many questions have been raised, which are fundamental questions about us human beings. Is society good for us? Is that a positive thing? Are we just puppets of our instincts as a kid, and everything else that we do is just a way of distracting us from the loss of those instincts? It just goes on and on. It's like, what is civilization? What is the heart of civilization? Is what he has said the heart of civilization? He has put his cards on the table, which allows you to ask the question, is that civilization? And what are the results of it? And what the problems that he's pointing to? Clearly, there are problems. What are they? And do you agree with the nature of the problem? So it's a great way of thinking about fundamental issues. So that's my 2 cents on what I got from this. So what did you get from this meetup? I'll ask everybody who wants to comment because we're going to do a part 2, right, Phil? We don't want to lose.
Let's do it. There's plenty of material for.
Yes. So we'll do part 2 a month from now. But if you have any comments about going through Freud, please go ahead. Lev, you're next.
I'll just say that this is my first time, and this was very fruitful right after listening to the audiobook for the second time just earlier today. Just my overall response to the book and what I heard here tonight is I'll just read these 2 sentences I wrote on my Substack. Freud's Civilization and its Discontents is a work of literary genius. Its effect is psychedelic. It is literature as medicine, and the medicalization of psychoanalysis represents a miscarriage of its potential. That's my response to this experience.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Lev. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Anybody else wants to comment about what they got? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. We're going to go with Jen. Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, this is great. I really like it. I think we are kind of like have a slower meetings. So we're really glad Philip is coming back. Really like his presentation. It's very high quality, thought provoking. I really enjoy it. Thanks, Shirkan, to organize it.
Thank you, Jen. Phil, what did you think
About the
about this experience? Yeah, about this book. Why did you choose this? What did you think of the discussion?
Right. So again, I think Freud is a deep thinker, and I might have mentioned this before. As I've read more and learned more, I appreciate asking questions more than getting answers. So even if the answer you get from Freud is not correct, I enjoy observing how he thinks, because that's, to me, is a much, if you can learn how to think deeply, the answers will come. Most people don't know how to think deeply about anything. They're afraid. What we do is we get answers, right? You read a book to get answers, not to learn how to think and ask the right questions. And with Freud, he provokes that because, like I mentioned, he most of his ideas, while they've had amazing currency in society and in popular culture, they're not actually employed by professional psychiatrists to a great extent. But they've had amazing impact on us as society, right? I mean, art, movies, literature. I mean, it's just politics, identity politics. A lot of what we experience today, it goes back to his thinking. We use his terminology as cliches, neuroses, Freudian slips, Oedipus complex. The one I didn't know, actually, this one, penis envy. I didn't realize that was Freud too. I thought that was just a urban type of, dictionary type of expression, but it is Freud, and we're actually going to get to it here. So there's just all sorts of things that have permeated our culture through his thinking. And this book in particular is so valuable because it brings several strands of thought together. One is psychology, and the other one is society. So society, psychology, and then it touches on all of these other important questions, right? Aesthetics, religion. I mean, it's very universalist, and I think this group is very well suited to this type of discussion because of Buckminster Fuller and just being interdisciplinary in your outlook. This is a great book because it touches on pretty much all the aspects of modernity and our experience as a human being.
Excellent. So what I want to do now is I want to ask a question to everybody. Phil, what is your situation? What time do you need to leave?
I got 10, 15 minutes.
Okay. So folks, I did a survey of, we've done about 1,600 meetups since COVID started on various topics. And I'm always looking for feedback. And I did a meetup just on what are the key topics that you would like to see. And one of the topics was psychology. So in psychology, I mean, we've spent a lot of time on Jung, and happy to revisit Jung. What psychology or what psychologist or writings on psychology have you found useful? So just very briefly, I want to, have people share what in psychology that they have found useful. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to share some of your favorite thinkers in psychology, or favorite books. Integration by Jung, very good. You can go ahead and you can either type it in or you can speak for a minute or so. Let's see, anybody else? Lev, go ahead.
I'll just share this hypothesis I've been developing just for the past few months. I'm new to, I discovered Spinoza recently, and the hypothesis I'm developing is that well, it's not a I would love to see a world in which more and more people rediscover or consider Spinoza as a starting point for the study of psyche, instead of where we have typically placed the starting point, which is late 19th, early 20th century. I find Spinoza just remarkably just illuminating as a sort of a foundational starting point for what came later with the Freuds and the Jungs of the world. That's just a quick comment on that.
Yeah, excellent point. Anybody else? Spinoza has very deep ideas on ethics and on psychology. He has this concept of conatus, which is really powerful concept. So because it doesn't matter whether a person is classified as a psychologist, you'll find some amazing things in we went through Aristotle's Poetics, and that has some really powerful ideas on psychology. So wherever they may be found. Will, go ahead.
Thanks, Shrikant. Yeah, well, just on psychology, I'm quite intrigued with the shadow, Carl Jung. I guess that's psychology, but it's probably dealing with biology a little bit in psychiatry also, I guess, where we're trying to repress. I haven't read any Jung. I only learned of the shadow about 12 months ago. I just saw something on it, but it makes a lot of sense to me that we're constantly repressing anger. We're told that it's unsavory from an early age, or jealousy, all these negative feelings. We repress them. And then I find you notice that a lot of people around you might be angry as well, and you're trying to repress that, if anger is arising. And I think it's fascinating to shine a light on these sort of subconscious motivations that are often we try to keep a lid on them. So that's something I find fascinating in psychology, is Carl Jung.
Excellent. Thank you, Will. We did an entire series on Carl Jung. We had about, for each of the, we tried to identify, I talked to several of the Jungians and tried to identify key concepts on Carl Jung. And for each of those concepts, we had a panel of Jungian psychoanalysts talk about it. So one of them is on shadow. It's a very powerful idea. It's a very simple idea of saying that if you're consciously focused on something which is opposite of that, you're not going to be as much aware of. So it's just like a light. When you put flashlight somewhere, your entire focus becomes transfixed on that, and whatever is behind you, whatever is not in light, kind of becomes the shadow. So it is the natural byproduct of the fact that we have limited consciousness, that we can keep only some things in conscious. And as a result of that, your entire self, your conception of that gets distorted, because you give priority to things which you are conscious of, and that becomes your ego, and you forget about the entire self. So being what they call reintegrating of the shadow is a way of being fully aware of your own self. So it's very, very powerful idea. So thank you. Let's see. Eleanor talks about Power versus Forth by David Hawkins, Art of Being by Eric Fromm. Okay, wonderful. Yes, and Sophia votes for Jung again. Yes, we have a number of people who are Jungians, who are good friends with 52 Living Ideas. So I would love to have some of these people come back and lecture. So Wonderful. All right. So, Phil, are there any psychologists apart from Freud you like?
Well, I'm surprised no one in this group mentioned Jordan Peterson. I mean, he is very good at,
Yes.
expounding some of the more, I guess, foundational psychologists. I mean, obviously somebody like Piaget, whom I have not really read, but I found out about him through Peterson's lectures on some of the journeys of self. And I mean, I think he's a really good clinical psychologist in general. So I find him very helpful in dealing with different things. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, if you want to contrast these folks to Freud and try to place them in context, what Jung does is that I think Jung is far more aware of ideas that are held across cultures. And from that, he has this idea of archetypes. So he's able to kind of integrate religion into his thinking at a very deep level, because he's looking for patterns that are common throughout, instead of just making observations at the immediate people around you and saying, oh, that's what is wrong with them based on some premises. He just starts by saying, let's see what people have thought and why they have thought it, and try to see kind of common patterns. So it's a very profound way of dealing with psyche. Jordan Peterson rests on Jung on one hand, and then people like Nietzsche or other folks on the other. We have done probably about 100 meetups on Jordan Peterson. We have gone through his books, multiple of his books, 12 principle, 12 rules, then more 12 rules. And then we went through the maps of meaning, which is by far his best.
Yeah, maps of meaning, I was going to mention that one, yeah.
Yeah, that is just incredible. We also went through his series on the Bible as well. So he's very good, and he's able to talk about, we also have done his series on him talking about different theories of psychology, which is a very good series. He gives very good introductions to these folks. So that one particular psychologist that has been very popular has been Carl Rogers. His view of human beings is exactly opposite that of Freud. He thinks that you can actually get things. It's good to deal with other people. Other people can positive addition to your life rather than a negative. So and he has this concept of authentic relating, which is a very profound concept of a way of kind of expanding your own limited idea of what you are by being aware of other views. So even if both of you have kind of limitations, those limitations are different. So if you are actually listening to the other person, it allows you a chance to learn about things about yourself that you don't know. And both people can, deepen their own connection to their own self as a result of that. So Carl Rogers is very, very interesting. So folks, thank you very much. And Phil, this is always a great series. So look forward to the part 2. And we'll see you. Let me just tell you about the 2 meetups coming up immediately, this Thursday and Saturday. Tomorrow, we're doing a meetup. We've done a series on the Bible, and we're kind of doing a wrap-up, kind of overview of things. So it's the most ambitious topic that we have taken up, and that is, what is the meaning of the cross? I mean, it's really the heart of Christianity. So that's going to be tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And then on Saturday, we are starting a new series on an architect, Louis Sullivan. His base is transcendentalism, and he is called the father of the modern architecture. He's considered to be the father of the skyscraper, figured out how to design skyscrapers for the first time. Just beautiful, has been a profound influence on me. He's the guy who said form follows function, and also less known principle that each problem contains its own solution. It's kind of intriguing sentence, but it is really profound. So we have a panelist of amazing people, 2 architects, one literary person, one philosopher, all of them going to be talking about this. This is going to be on Saturday, starting this Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So hope you can make some of these things, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody. Thanks, Phil.